banks make money? By making debt loans. Debt equals money, pile. Remember that. Debt equals money. The more loans they make, the more money they make.
But if they don't have any money, then where did my money come from?
You're gonna want to take a step back, pile.
No one is allowed inside the Fed. Not you, not me, no American citizen, no duly elected member of our Congress, not the Supreme Court.
Not the Supreme Court?
Not the Supreme Court, not the Justice Department, not the CIA, DIA, FBI, ATF, ATE, NBC, not even G.O.D.
How come the government isn't allowed inside its own building?
Government? Pile, the Fed is a private bank owned by private stockholders. Do not let the name Federal fool you. This place is about as federal as Federal Express.
A private bank? But private?
Shh. Most people don't have a clue how currency is created. Economists and bankers make it sound so complex that people think they can't understand it. But I'm going to strip our monetary system down to its essence so that you can see the scam behind the curtain and just how it affects you. Every modern society creates currency in pretty much the same way. But since the US dollar is the majority of the world's currency, I'm going to use the United States as our example. It all starts when some politician says, "Vote for me and I'll make sure the government provides you more free stuff than my opponent will." But there's no such thing as a free lunch. So to provide that supposedly free stuff, the politicians vote for the country to spend more than its income. This is called deficit spending. To pay for that deficit spending, the Treasury borrows currency by issuing a bond. So what's a bond? If you think about it, a bond is really nothing but a glorified IOU. It's a pretty piece of paper with numbers printed on it that says, "Loan me $1 trillion today, and I promise over a 10-year period I'm going to pay you back that $1 trillion plus interest." But what you need to understand is that Treasury bonds are our national debt. These glorified IOUs are to be paid back by you and I and our descendants through future taxation. Therefore, when the government issues a bond, it steals prosperity out of the future so that it can spend it today. The Treasury then holds a bond auction, and the world's largest banks show up and compete to buy part of our national debt and make a profit on it by earning interest. You'll notice that as we move through this process, the big banks are there, taking a cut every step of the way. This isn't by chance, as you'll see shortly. Then, through a shell game called open market operations, the banks get to sell some of those bonds to the Federal Reserve at a profit. To pay for the bonds, the Federal Reserve opens up its big old checkbook and writes bad, bogus, counterfeit checks that should bounce because they're drawn on an account that always has a zero balance. There isn't one penny in there. To quote from the Boston Federal Reserve, "When you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover that check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money." The Fed then hands those checks to the banks, and at this point, currency springs into existence. The banks then take that currency and buy more bonds at the next Treasury auction. But what is a check? A check is also an IOU. When you write a check, you're making a note that says, "Here's my IOU for cash. All you have to do is go to the bank and pick it up." Now, it's very, very important that you understand this process because we're going to come back later and show you the devastating effect this has on you. The Treasury issues IOUs, bonds. The banks then buy those IOUs with currency. The Federal Reserve then writes IOUs, checks, and hands them to the banks in exchange for the Treasury's IOUs, the bonds. And currency is created. So what's really happening is the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are just swapping IOUs, using the banks as middlemen, and abracadabra, presto, currency magically springs into existence. This process repeats and repeats over and over again, enriching the banks and indebting the public by raising the national debt. The end result is that there's a buildup of bonds at the Federal Reserve and currency at the Treasury. This process is also where all paper currency comes from.
Nobody gets a friggin' dollar that the Fed didn't print.
So?
They print the money, then they loan it to the government, then they charge the government interest, then the government taxes you to pay for it. Wake up, Pie!
What's he doing?
How do banks make money, Pile?
By making more loans?
Oh, that's right. He's good. See, he prints more IOUs without any more gold, loans them out for interest, makes a pretty penny, and nobody is the wiser. This discovery is called fractional reserve banking. In the wrong hands, it's more powerful than the nuclear bomb in its ability to completely and utterly destroy a nation who is subjected to its perversion.
Fractional reserve lending is exactly what it says. The banks are allowed to reserve only a fraction of your deposit and loan the rest out. Although reserve ratios may vary, I'm going to use a 10% reserve ratio as our example. If you deposit $100 in your account, the bank can legally take $90 of it and loan it out without telling you. The bank must hold $10 of your deposit in reserve just in case you want some of it. These reserves are called vault cash. But why does your bank account still say you have $100 if the bank has stolen $90 of it? Because the bank left IOUs it created, called bank credit, in its place. Now I know this sounds crazy, but here it is in black and white from the Fed. Commercial banks create checkbook money when they grant a loan simply by adding new deposit dollars in accounts on their books in exchange for a borrower's IOU. These are nothing but numbers that the banks type into their computers. And even though these bank credit IOU numbers are very different from base currency numbers, because they only exist in computers, they are still currency. So now there is $190 in existence. Now the reason people take out loans from the banks is to buy something. They're going to buy a house or a car or something like that. So the borrower takes the $90 that the bank loaned to him from your account.
Extra set of balls, put them on, you're gonna need them.
But then the seller deposits that currency into his account, and his bank loans out 90% of that and leaves bank credit numbers in its place. So now there's $271 in existence. This process repeats and repeats until under a 10% reserve ratio, an initial deposit of just $100 can create up to $1,000 of bank credit, all backed by $100 of vault cash, just 10%. But as I said, reserve ratios vary wildly. On some deposits, it's 10%, on others, it's 3%, and on some forms of deposits, reserve requirements are 0. The result is that the expansion of the currency supply by the banks is far greater than even this example would lead you to believe. So once again, when currency is deposited in the banks get to lend it out, and then it gets redeposited and relent, redeposited and relent, redeposited and relent over and over again, creating bank credit all the way. This is where the vast majority of our currency supply comes from.
Unless everybody wanted their gold back at the same time.
No. That's my gold.
Not anymore.
What are you talking about?
I'd like to redeem my IOUs, please. Thank you very much.
Hey!
Do you even know what money is, pal? In the long ago, people bartered. They traded things they had for things they wanted. I'll trade you my raspberries for that there pot pie.
I don't want your berries.
Come on. Wow, those sweet berries.
They're not sweet. They're old, and I don't like berries.
Give me that pot pie!
No!
As you can see, this bartering situation created some problems. Then one day, a goldsmith walked up and said,
Now, everybody thinks gold is valuable, so why doesn't everybody trade gold for things they need?
a price was set for gold, and now it was very easy to conduct commerce because people could trade gold for all the things they needed.
Armin! Wow, look at all my gold!
Once upon a time, we used gold, or paper that represented safely stored gold, as money. It worked well for thousands of years, partly because gold is independent, and partly because it keeps its purchasing power. An ounce of gold buys you as much food, clothing, and energy as it did 50, or 150, or 1,550 years ago.
People could walk into a bank and exchange a piece of paper money to gold. After 1945, however, this changed.
A new government broke with tradition. England went off the gold standard and devalued the pound.
Currencies were pegged to the dollar, which was pegged to gold at a rate of $35 per ounce.
In recent weeks, the speculators have been waging an all-out war
on the American dollar. The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
Individuals were no longer allowed to exchange paper money to gold, but central banks were.
Compare that to modern money, which seems to buy you less and less each year.
And the amount of it in circulation depended on a government's gold or silver reserves. But after the U.S. abolished the system in 1971,
look at the mess the UK and Germany got the world into after leaving the gold standard in 1914. World War I, German reparations, Weimar inflation. Look at the mess the world has got itself into since 1971, when this fiat system became the global norm. An endless sea of wars, debt, poverty, social inequality, economic bubbles, rampant consumerism, and environmental rape. None of which could ever have happened to anything like the same extent, with that little bit of discipline and restraint imposed by gold.
Hey, stop them! That's my gold!
Damn thieves!
Say there, Pile. I've got a vault and some guards. I can keep your gold safe for you for a small fee.
Yeah, sure, that'd be awesome.
You see, Pyle, this is how the first bank made money.
People started storing their gold in well-guarded vaults and bought goods and services using the receipts given to them by those running the vaults. Pieces of paper they could always exchange for real gold.
There you go, Pile. I owe you 100 gold coins.
Okay, great.
Come back anytime and redeem your gold when you want it. It'll be right here in my vault.
Look.
1775. The American Revolutionary War began as the American colonies sought to detach from England and its oppressive monarchy.
They're in America, too? The Red Shield banks are here, Pyle, seeking a way to conquer our American dream. They tried to take over our country many times and failed because Jefferson and the Patriots vowed to stop the evil tyrants at all costs. Yeah.
To preserve our independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. We must make our choice between economy and liberty or profusion and servitude. Wow. I place economy among the first and most important of Republican virtues, and public debt is the greatest of the dangers to be feared. It is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes.
We must have a central bank to secure this country's finances.
If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their money, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of their property.
They take our property away right in front of our eyes, just like Thomas Jefferson said they would.
Until their children will wake up homeless on the very continent their fathers conquered.
Jefferson, you're mad. This country will have a central bank.
Who's that?
America's first Secretary of Treasury.
Alexander Hamilton?
Not for long. Aaron Burr, Thomas Jefferson's vice president. They didn't take too kindly to our first Sec Treasury. Sweet shot, Burr. The first attempt at a central bank only lasted 20 years and we shut it down. But the bankers tried again against Old Hickory President Andrew Jackson.
You are a den of vipers and thieves. I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out.
After surviving an assassination attempt, Jackson finally defeated the bank in 1836. When asked what was the greatest accomplishment in his life, Old Hickory replied,
I killed the bank.
And those were his last words. I killed the bank. And with real money backed with real gold, our country experienced the greatest boom in any nation's history. Oh, it was beautiful, pal. But the bankers, greedy for more power and wealth, were concocting their most ambitious plan yet to once and for all take control of the finances of the United States.
And in the early 1900s, they sought to push, once again, legislation to create another central bank. However, they knew the government and public were very weary of such an institution, so they needed to create an incident to affect public opinion. So, J.P. Morgan, publicly considered a financial luminary at the time, exploited his mass influence by publishing rumors that a prominent bank in New York was insolvent or bankrupt. Morgan knew this would cause mass hysteria, which would affect other banks as well. And it did. The public, in fear of losing their deposits, immediately began mass withdrawals. Consequently, the banks were forced to call in their loans, causing the recipients to sell their property, and thus a spiral of bankruptcies, repossessions, and turmoil emerged. Putting the pieces together a few years later, Frederick Allen of Life magazine wrote, "The Morgan interests took advantage to precipitate the panic, guiding it shrewdly as it progressed." Unaware of the fraud, the Panic of 1907 led to a congressional investigation headed by Senator Nelson Aldrich, who had intimate ties to the banking cartels and later became part of the Rockefeller family through marriage. The commission, led by Aldrich, recommended a central bank should be implemented so a panic like 1907 could never happen again. This was the spark the international bankers needed to initiate their plan. In 1910, a secret meeting was held at a J.P. Morgan estate on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. It was there that the central banking bill called the Federal Reserve Act was written. This legislation was written by bankers, not lawmakers. This meeting was so secretive, so concealed from government and public knowledge that the 10 or so figures who attended disguised their names when en route to the island. After this bill was constructed, it was then handed over to their political frontman, Senator Nelson Aldrich, to push through Congress. And in 1913, with heavy political sponsorship by the bankers, Woodrow Wilson became president, having already agreed to sign the Federal Reserve Act in exchange for campaign support. And 2 days before Christmas, when most of Congress was at home with their families, the Federal Reserve Act was voted in, and Wilson in turn made it law. Later, Woodrow Wilson wrote, in regret,
In 1910, a secret meeting was held at a J.P. Morgan estate on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia.
This meeting was so secretive, so concealed from government and public knowledge that the 10 attendees used code names.
I am clearly the richest man, so I should be the one to run the super-secret central bank. I own all the oil in America. I'm clearly richer than you will ever be, hula girl. I should run the super-secret central bank. You're nothing compared to me, lube job. I shall run the secret bank.
Silence!
Supreme Master Leader, I didn't know you were gonna be here.
I'm not. Neither are you, dumbass.
Oh, yeah, right. He's so smart.
None of you shall run the bank. We have failed in the past because of openness. This time, the key to success is secrecy. The people must believe that they run the bank.
Yes, brilliant! A sneak attack. What's the plan?
We first create panic, then we show them the solution. With our man in office and well-planned timing, we will have our central bank. And so the people think it is theirs. We shall christen it Federal. The Federal Reserve.
They struck on December 23rd, 1913. When most of our Congress were at home eating fruitcake, these bastards, bankers, presented their treasonous act to their newly elected accomplice, Woodrow Wilson, who had fortuitously already agreed to sign it before he was even elected.
Wait, the IRS? I thought we always had the IRS.
No, pal. They did this to us too. The Fed now has the exclusive power to print America's money. They loan this money to our banks and our government at interest, putting immediate debt on our own money, printing more and more, so each dollar they print becomes worth less than the one before. What in the hell is that? That, pal, is how our government now must pay back these debts to the Fed. Your taxes do not go to your government.
They don't?
It's the greatest theft in human history.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
This is the last president to stand up to the Fed. You must see. On June 4, 1963, President Kennedy signed Executive Order 11110. This executive order empowered the U.S. Treasury to issue real money without the Fed. It would have worked. Kennedy's plan to dismantle the Federal Reserve machine had begun. But 6 months later, John F. Kennedy went to Dallas and never returned.
No way. No way they could do that.
The new president, Lyndon Johnson, threw out Kennedy's order. And since JFK, no president has dared confront the secret powers behind the Federal Reserve.
During the American Civil War, Lincoln bypassed the high-interest loans offered by the European bankers. In 1862, he issued debt-free notes called greenbacks to pay the costs of the Civil War. The government should create, issue, and circulate all the currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of consumers. The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of government, but is the government's greatest creative opportunity. By the adoption of these principles, the taxpayers will be saved immense sums of interests. Money will cease to be the master and become the servant of humanity. Democracy will rise superior to the money power. Before completion of his second term as president, on April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. As the newly elected United States President, Garfield was publicly open about his views on the banking system. Whosoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or another, by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate. Within a few weeks of making this statement, on September 19, 1881, President James Garfield was assassinated. As a former bank president, McFadden understood the banking system intimately. In 1929, the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. McFadden blamed the Federal Reserve for causing the crash and fueling the Depression. In 1932, McFadden moved to induce charges against the Federal Reserve Board. We have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of the United States, and has practically bankrupted our government. This is an era of economic misery, and for the conditions that caused that misery, the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks are fully liable. Following 2 unsuccessful assassination attempts, on October the 3rd, 1936, Louis McFadden was assassinated.
They consolidate bigger and bigger banks, print more and more money, accountable to no one, decimating our nation's wealth for the benefit of a few. Those sons of bitches! Sons of bitches all.
In the wake of the dot-com bust in September 11th, Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan lowers interest rates to only 1% to keep the economy strong. 1% is a very low return on investment, so the investors say no thanks. On the flip side, this means banks on Wall Street can borrow from the Fed for only 1%.
We need to understand the mumbo-jumbo of the so-called debt ceiling. It's all based on a huge paradox. there was interest due on that bond. And there was interest due on every one of those loans that the banks made. That means that there is interest due on every dollar in existence. Let me ask you something. If you borrow the very first dollar into existence, and that's the only dollar that exists on the planet, but you promise to pay it back plus another dollar's worth of interest, where do you get the second dollar to pay the interest? The answer is that you have to borrow that one into existence and promise to pay it back with interest as well. So now there are $2 in existence, but you owe $4, and so on and so on. The result is there's never enough currency to pay the debt. There is always more debt in the system than there is currency in existence to pay the debt. Therefore, the whole system is impossible. It is finite. It will come to an end one day. Whether you're making a payment on a loan or paying tax to make a payment on a bond, the portion of the payment that goes to pay off the principal extinguishes that portion of the debt. But the debt also extinguishes the currency. Currency and debt are like matter and antimatter. When they meet, they annihilate each other. If we just pay off the principal only on all the loans and bonds that exist, the entire currency supply just vanishes. So if we don't go deeper into debt every year, look what happens. The whole thing goes into a deflationary collapse under the weight of those payments. This is why any talk of a debt ceiling is not only ridiculous, it's delusional. The system is designed to require ever-increasing levels of debt just to continue. And that's why politicians will always kick the can down the road and raise this so-called debt ceiling over and over again until the whole system finally collapses under its own weight. This is a fraud. It is a pyramid scheme, it is a Ponzi scheme, it's a scam, and it's a lie. Our entire monetary system is nothing but a form of legalized theft. But here's the biggest con job of them all. The Federal Reserve is not federal, it has stockholders. There is no federal agency that has stockholders. What's a stockholder? A share of stock represents a percentage of ownership in a corporation. So the stockholders are the owners of that corporation. Therefore, the Federal Reserve is a private corporation with owners. And you can see it for yourself if you go to the Federal Reserve's website, and it will say, the stockholders receive an annual dividend of 6%. Much of our taxes are not used for schools, roads, and public services, but to pay interest on bonds that the Federal Reserve bought with a check drawn on an account that has nothing in it. The Federal Reserve is committing fraud. But here's one of the biggest secrets of them all. Before the establishment of the Federal Reserve, there was no need for personal income tax. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and that very same year, the Constitution was amended to allow income tax. Do you really think this was just a coincidence? Ask yourself how much income tax you've paid over your lifetime. Much of it has been silently siphoned away into the hands of those who own the system. So our entire currency supply is nothing but a couple of bucks whipped up in this hocus-pocus scam where the Treasury and the Federal Reserve swap glorified IOUs, and a bunch of numbers that the banks just type into their computers. That's it. That's our entire currency supply. It's nothing but a supply of numbers. Some of them printed, most of them typed, and there is nothing else.
Oh, where are we? Battle of Waterloo! Hold on, we gotta get through!
In short, it is reported that Nathan Rothschild was given something in the sum of $3 million by Prince William IX of Hesse-Hanau, and obviously he had entrusted him to look after that money and keep it safe for him. But he had actually kept the fortune and invested it in gold to be used to fund and profit the Napoleonic War. By 1815, the 5 Rothschild brothers worked to supply gold to both Wellington's army through Nathan in England and Napoleon's army through Jacob in France. And began their policy of funding both sides of the war. This is exactly what central banks do. They have done it for thousands and thousands of years.
A money machine! There it is!
Hey, is that the same people?
Rich banker men from Germany flying under the banner of the Red Shield. They finance both sides of the war.
Whilst the Rothschilds were funding both sides of this war, they used the banks they had spread out across Europe to give them the opportunity to set up unrivaled postal service network of secret routes and fast couriers. The post that these couriers carried was opened by these couriers and their details given to the Rothschilds, so that they always were one step ahead of the current events. Furthermore, these Rothschilds couriers were the only merchants allowed to pass through English and French blockades. It was these couriers who also kept Nathan Mayer Rothschild up to date with how the war was going, so he could use that intelligence to buy and sell from his position on the stock exchange in accordance with that information.
That's him, the Red Shield courier! Shoot him!
No, I'm not shooting anyone.
Damn it, Pye!
One of the Rothschilds' couriers was a man named Rothworth. When the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo was won by the British, Rothworth took off for the Channel and was able to deliver the news to Nathan Mayer Rothschild a full 24 hours before Wellington's own courier arrived in London. At that time, British bonds were called consols, and they were traded on the floor of the stock exchange. Nathan Mayer Rothschild instructed all of his workers on the floor to start selling consols. They made all the other traders believe that the British had lost the war, so they started selling frantically and caused a panic.
What? He beat everyone back with the news of the war and told England that Napoleon won. The Red Shield bankers in London pretended that England was doomed and started selling their English stocks. The English went into a selling frenzy to get rid of worthless English money.
But the English won, right?
Of course they won.
Therefore, the consols plummeted in value, and Nathan Mayer Rothschild then discreetly instructed his workers to purchase all the consols they could lay their hands on. When the news came through that the British had actually won the war, the consols went up to a level even higher than before the war ended, leaving Mayer Rothschild with a return of approximately 20 to 1 on his investment. And this gave the Rothschild family complete control of the British economy, which then the financial centre of the world following Napoleon's defeat, and it forced England to set up a new Bank of England, which Nathan Mayer Rothschild controlled.
But it was a trick by Red Shield. They waited until the stocks plummeted to pennies and then bought England back for nearly nothing.
What? They did that? How?
When the English leaders found out, they had no choice but to give themselves over to the Red Shield. Their money was gone and they were slaves to the Red Shield war debt. Since that time, the English have been paying their national taxes directly to the Red Shield private bankers. The people have no idea. But the bankers bragged about what they did to us, laughing at us all the way to the bank.
Why, it's the best business I've ever done. If I can control a nation's wealth, I care not who makes its laws.
Tulips, which are native to Central Asia, became a very popular flower in the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, especially during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. During this period, it not only became a status symbol, but also came to represent God, so the plant was cultivated in the royal gardens and displayed in a great deal of artwork. In 1554, the tulip found its way to Europe when the Holy Roman Empire's ambassador in Istanbul, Busbek, sent the first tulip bulb to Austria. Fast forward to 1593, and a famed Flemish botanist, Carolus Classius, planted several tulip bulbs in his botanical garden. Over time, he proved their ability to grow in the harsh conditions of the Low Countries, plus he discovered the tulip breaking virus. This virus made the flowers bloom with colours that appeared flame-like, which ultimately made them more desirable. But the plants took over 7 years to properly mature, and the supply could not keep up with the demand, so price inflation was somewhat inevitable. The initial market for the plants was in the Netherlands. They had recently achieved their independence from Spain and, thanks to overseas trade, had an ever-growing middle class. This middle class, eager to display their newfound wealth, were quick to adopt the flower as a status symbol. Nevertheless, the price of tulips initially remained relatively stable until around 1634, when French merchants began to buy tulips for their wives. sellers began to stockpile tulips, further increasing the price and, in turn, making the tulip appear as a sound investment. So rather than planting tulips, the largely inexperienced investors began to buy tulips with the intention of reselling, and this craze began to grip the nation. Therefore, throughout the winter months of 1636 and 37, the price of tulips had shot through the roof. A certain species of tulip, the Viceroy, could fetch around 2,500 guilders, or around 16.5 years' pay for a skilled worker. But the smarter traders began to see the market as unmanageable and failed to reinvest their money into it. Then, in February 1637, the bubble burst when a tulip auction in Haarlem failed to attract any buyers. The merchants who still had tulips were thrown into a panic and tried to quickly sell off these now worthless flowers, causing the price to drop significantly. It was made even worse because many florists had been selling tulips they did not yet own to buyers who couldn't afford it. So the Dutch government tried to step in and offered 10% cancellation fee to void any contracts, but it did little to prevent many people losing a vast amount of money.
You can't take my house! Is that your signature?
Oh, okay, well, just help me work something out, okay? I mean, you said I'm a good credit guy, right? I mean, hey, wait! My dog is in there! No, don't take my dream! Oh, how did this happen?
Subprime mortgages, collateralized debt obligations, frozen credit markets, and credit default swaps. Who's affected? Everyone. How did it happen? Here's how. Homeowners represent their mortgages, and investors represent their money. These mortgages represent houses, and this money represents large institutions like pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign funds, mutual funds, etc. These groups are brought together through the financial system, a bunch of banks and brokers commonly known as Wall Street. These banks on Wall Street are closely connected to these houses on Main Street. Here's how it works. A family wants a house, so they save for a down payment and contact a mortgage broker. The mortgage broker connects the family to a lender who gives them a mortgage. The broker makes a nice commission. The family buys a house and becomes homeowners. This is great for them because housing prices have been rising practically forever. Everything works out nicely. One day, the lender gets a call from an investment banker who wants to buy the mortgage. The lender sells it to him for a very nice fee. The investment banker then borrows millions of dollars and buys thousands more mortgages and puts them into a nice little box. This means that every month he gets the payments from the homeowners of all the mortgages in the box. Then he sicks his banker wizards on it to work their financial magic, which is basically cutting it into 3 slices: safe, okay, and risky. They pack the slices back up in the box and call it a collateralized debt obligation. The investment banker can sell the safe slice to the investors who only want safe investments. He sells the okay slice to other bankers, and the risky slices to hedge funds and other risk takers. The investment banker makes millions. He then repays his loans. Finally, the investors have found a good investment for their money, much better than the 1% Treasury bills. They're so pleased they want more CDO slices. So the investment banker calls up the lender, wanting more mortgages. The lender calls up the broker for more homeowners, but the broker can't find anyone. Everyone that qualifies for a mortgage already has one, but they have an idea.
Who's there? No, 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 no! I don't have any more money!
When homeowners default on their mortgage, the lender gets the house. Since they're covered if the homeowners default, lenders can start adding risk to new mortgages, not requiring down payments, no proof of income, no documents at all. And that's exactly what they did. So instead of lending to responsible homeowners, called prime mortgages, they started to get some that were, well, less responsible. These are subprime mortgages. This is the turning point. So, just like always, the mortgage broker connects the family with a lender and a mortgage, making his commission. The family buys a big house. The lender sells the mortgage to the investment banker, who turns it into a CDO and sells slices to the investors and others. This actually works out nicely for everyone and makes them all rich. No one was worried because as soon as they sold the mortgage to the next guy, it was his problem. If the homeowners were to default, they didn't care. They were selling off their risk to the next guy and making millions, like playing hot potato with a time bomb. Not surprisingly, the homeowners default on their mortgage, which at this moment is owned by the banker. This means he forecloses and one of his monthly payments turns into a house. No big deal. He puts it up for sale. But more and more of his monthly payments turn into houses. Now there are so many houses for sale on the market, creating more supply than there is demand, and housing prices aren't rising anymore. In fact, they plummet. This creates an interesting problem for homeowners still paying their mortgages. As all the houses in their neighborhood go up for sale, the value of their house goes down, and they start to wonder why they're paying back their $300,000 mortgage when the house is now worth only $90,000.
As the Roaring Twenties were drawing to an end, so too was an era of relative prosperity for many Americans. As early as 1926, the construction of new housing had decreased. Businesses had too much inventory and too few buyers. Nevertheless, an optimistic America wanted to believe that the good times would last forever, pointing to fortunes that were being made on the stock market. Even people with little money to spare wanted in on the action, and stockbrokers readily agreed to sell shares on margin, where they would lend citizens money to buy stock. These investors figured the stock's price was bound to go up and up, allowing them to pay back the stock's original price tenfold. The constantly rising price of stocks cast a spell over the nation. Noon-hour traffic stood still as people eagerly awaited news of their improved finances. Even distinguished Yale University economist Irving Fisher made a bold speculation.
The nation is marching along a permanently high plateau of prosperity.
But the simple fact was that the price paid for many stocks was unduly out of proportion to the actual profitability of the companies who issued them, creating the illusion of increased value. On October 29, 1929, reality finally caught up with the stock market, and what went up came crashing back down. Panicked investors sold 16 million shares in a single day, many for just pennies a share. Millions of other stocks went unsold entirely on that afternoon, known as Black Tuesday.
The dot-com bubble started around 1997, peaked in 2000, and ultimately burst by 2002. Simply put, investors were so excited about the progress of the internet that they invested in pretty much any tech company with a pulse. They stopped caring about whether or not a company was profitable, or at least could eventually become profitable. Common sense became a rarity. From 1997 to March 2000, prices went up about 5 times, only to go down 5 times and return to their pre-boom levels from 2000 to 2002. A drop which was also exacerbated by the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001.
We are heading towards an electronic currency where there's no cash. Some of you think it can't be done. Well, they're already doing it, essentially. They've already got you believing those pieces of plastic in your wallet. And they started out with, what, MasterCharge, Bank Americard, remember that? They've been doing this for 40 years. They've been conditioning. preconditioning you for what's to come. This is my opinion. They've already got you believing those things it actually is money, and you've been trading and transacting in it for quite a long time now, online, grocery stores, everywhere. It used to be you had to have like a minimum of $20 charge or something. Now it's you buy candy bar with a credit card. Now you can pay it for a parking meter with credit card. You can go laundromat, credit card. It's everywhere. There's some places now they're starting, the trend now is becoming slowly where no cash is even accepted. Recently I saw a toll road in Chicago, no cash accepted. I think it was Alabama or some state in the South declared that no more cash could be used for secondhand items or something. And then there's things like even everything you see now are geared more towards credit cards. A lot of you don't even have cards or don't even have cash anymore. So they're conditioning you. They're making you believe this. And someday, here's where it all starts changing. Someday you wake up and all of a sudden the banks are closed. There's a banking emergency. Nobody knows when the banks are going to reopen. You're running out of money. The ATM machines aren't working. Everything's breaking down. Society is going to kaput because there's no more cash anymore. And they'll leave it at this state for weeks, maybe even months, while you suffer to get you to go along with this new system. It will be in place, and one day then in the future, after this collapses, whatever sort it's going to be, they'll have this new national ID card. And because you lost $10,000 in your old account, just to pick a number here, we're going to be, of the kindness of our heart, we're going to give you 10,000 of these new credits. And apply this into your account, your national ID account, and you can use this immediately at your leisure to buy all the things you need to buy, just like nothing ever happened. And 99.9% of you will go right along with it because, oh great, now I didn't lose any money. But you didn't have any money to begin with, but they got you believing you did, and now they got these new credits where they can completely control and enslave you even more so than you ever were in the past. Everything you do and buy and sell will be done through this card, national ID card. And then at some point, the national ID card won't even work properly because there'll be so much fraud involved that hacking, stealing, whatever, there'll be so much fraud that somewhere down the road after that point in time, they're going to introduce this microchip that you'll gladly accept too.
No banks, no fees, no inflation. These are the potential perks of this thing called Bitcoin. But is Bitcoin really the money of the future?
Bitcoin.
Bitcoin. It's all the rage, but what the hell is it? And why should you care? Bitcoins are stored in a digital wallet in the cloud or on your computer. You can buy furniture, flights, even haircuts online and use them at bars, restaurants, and other businesses in the real world. There's now even a Bitcoin ATM in British Columbia. And last week, someone bought a $100,000 Tesla car using only Bitcoins. Is it the currency of the future?
Money can be sent from here to Hong Kong and back instantly for free.
But not everyone is sold. Here are the 3 ways to get your hands on Bitcoins. You can buy them online, transfer them to and from other users, or mine them on your computer. That's how new Bitcoins are created, when someone digs them up by solving very complex math problems online. Currently, roughly 25 Bitcoins are mined every 10 minutes. So, is this the end of the George Costanza wallet?
That's how the press will spin it. Your life will be so much under control, even more so than it is now.